On the morning of the 15th of May 1940, whilst panzer divisions carved through the Ardennes and Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft photographed every railway junction and motorway in northern France, a flotilla of 17 narrow boats churned silently through the Kennet and Avon Canal, carrying 340 tons of ammunition, medical supplies and encrypted communications equipment for the British Expeditionary Force. The boats moved at precisely 3.2 miles per hour, slower than a man's walking pace. Their engines produced a distinctive rattling diesel sound that could be heard from half a mile away. They were crewed largely by women over the age of 50, and men classified as medically unfit for military service. German intelligence officers, poring over thousands of reconnaissance photographs, noted the boats in their reports and classified them as non-military commercial traffic. They were spectacularly, catastrophically wrong. This wasn't a failure of intelligence, it was a masterclass in hiding military capability inside the most mundane, most overlooked infrastructure imaginable. And the Germans never realised that Britain's canal network was moving the equivalent of 200 lorries worth of supplies every single day without consuming a single gallon of rationed petrol. The narrow boats looked like relics even by 1940 standards. Designed for canals built in the 1770s, they measured exactly 72 feet long by 7 feet wide, dimensions dictated by the lock chambers at Braunston, built in 1796. Their engines, when fitted with engines at all, produced between 12 and 25 horsepower. A single German Opel Blitz lorry could carry 3 tons at 50 miles per hour on paved roads. A narrow boat carried 25 tons at 3 miles per hour through waterways that meandered through the countryside like a drunk man's path home. On paper, this shouldn't have worked. Yet by August 1940, whilst the Luftwaffe pummeled British roads and rail lines, the canal network was moving 47% of all munitions from the Midlands factories to southern England without losing a single ton to enemy action. The Germans were bombing empty lorries on motorways whilst the real supplies floated beneath tree cover, invisible from the air, moving through a transport network that hadn't changed since Trafalgar. Standard military logistics doctrine in 1940 emphasized speed, capacity and centralized control. The German Kraftfahrkampftruppen, motorized combat troops, had demonstrated in Poland that rapid mechanized supply lines could sustain blitzkrieg operations. German logistics manuals specified that supply vehicles should maintain 40 to 60 kilometers per hour on improved roads, with centralized depots feeding mechanized columns. The British Army's own pre-war doctrine, outlined in the 1935 Field Service Regulations, prioritised railway transport supplemented by motor lorries for tactical flexibility. Canals weren't mentioned in military planning documents after 1918. They were considered obsolete, casualties of the railway age and the internal combustion engine. Military theorists argue that canals suffered from fundamental insurmountable limitations. They were slow, geographically constrained to their fixed routes, vulnerable to frost in winter and drought in summer, and required specialised crews with intimate knowledge of each waterway. General Sir John Dill, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, initially dismissed canal transport as pittoresque but impractical for modern warfare. The Ministry of War Transport calculated that it would require 23 canal boats to match the daily tonnage of 6 motor lorries, and the lorries could reach any destination with a road, whilst the boats were trapped in their medieval channels. Critics were right about the speed. They were catastrophically wrong about what mattered. The secret was in what made canal boats different, not what made them worse. Britain's inland waterway network comprised 4,250 miles of navigable canals and rivers in 1940, a figure that hadn't changed substantially since 1850. Whilst Germany had invested in autobahns and Italy in railways, Britain's canal infrastructure remained exactly as it had been during the Napoleonic Wars. This seemed like strategic neglect. To the planners at the Ministry of War Transport facing the Luftwaffe's photographic reconnaissance, it meant something entirely different, a transport network the Germans didn't consider worth mapping. The Grand Union Canal, completed in 1929 to link London with Birmingham, could accommodate boats carrying up to 25 tons. The older narrow canals, the Shropshire Union, the Leeds and Liverpool, the Kennet and Avon, restricted loads to 20 to 23 tons depending on the depth. These weren't impressive figures compared to the London and North Eastern Railway's freight capacity. What mattered was what they carried those tons through. Canal routes wound through terrain carefully selected by 18th century engineers to maintain gentle gradients. This meant they followed valleys, passed under tree cover, threaded through cuttings, and disappeared into tunnels for miles at a stretch. The Standedge Tunnel, built in 1811, ran for 3.1 miles through the Pennines. 3.1 miles where a cargo boat could travel completely invisible from aerial reconnaissance. The Hare Castle Tunnel on the Trent and Mersey Canal, 1.6 miles of complete concealment. The Blisworth Tunnel, 1.75 miles. Modern militaries thought in terms of roads and railways, linear infrastructure visible from 6,000 feet. Canal engineers had thought in terms of contours and water supply. They'd built their network to be invisible from surrounding high ground. Reconnaissance pilots saw rivers. They didn't see the parallel cuts 20 feet to the side, hidden by hedgerows and tree growth. German photographic interpreters, trained to identify railway marshalling yards and road junctions, looked at canal traffic and saw civilian commerce. They weren't wrong, it was civilian commerce. But 40% of that commerce, by August 1940, was under direct Ministry of War transport charter, carrying military supplies in unmarked boats that looked identical to the coal barges they'd been the week before. On 7th September 1940, the first day of the London Blitz, Luftwaffe formations struck 23 railway stations, 15 major road junctions, and 37 petrol storage facilities across southern England. That same day, 142 narrow boats moved through the Grand Union Canal, carrying 3,200 tons of ammunition from the Royal Ordnance Factory at Chorley to forward depots at Uxbridge and Slough. Not one was attacked. Not one was even photographed. German intelligence assessments from September 1940, captured after the war, note severely disrupted ground transport in southern sector, whilst British Ministry of War transport records show canal tonnage actually increased by 23% during the same period. The proof wasn't just in what the Germans didn't bomb, it was in what British units received. The 1st Armoured Division, refitting near Aldershot after Dunkirk, required 180 tons of supplies daily. Ministry records show that between June and October 1940, 67% of their ammunition arrived via the Basingstoke Canal, a narrow, winding waterway that passed within 8 miles of their depot. The supplies were unloaded at night into unmarked lorries for the final leg. German reconnaissance photographs from July 1940 show the road junction near the canal basin. Intelligence assessments note minimal motor transport activity. They were photographing the lorries during the day when they sat empty. The actual transfer happened between 2200 and 400, when German night reconnaissance was focused on cities and bomber targeting. A captured Luftwaffe intelligence officer, Hauptmann Ernst Richter, interrogated in November 1940, provided inadvertent confirmation. Asked about British supply lines, he explained, "We focused reconnaissance on railways and major roads. These were the critical networks. The canals, we understood, carried coal and commercial goods. They were slow, inefficient, not military targets." The interrogation report notes his visible confusion when shown photographs of narrow boats carrying camouflaged ammunition crates. His response, "This is not logical. Why would they use such primitive methods?" The interrogator's notation reads, "Subject appears genuinely surprised." Assessment: German intelligence doctrine did not consider canal transport militarily significant. The numbers reveal the scale of German miscalculation. Between May and December 1940, British canal boats moved 890,000 tons of military supplies, equivalent to the cargo capacity of 44,500 lorry journeys. At an average fuel consumption of 12 miles per gallon for a 3-ton lorry, this represented a saving of approximately 750,000 gallons of petrol that didn't exist. Britain's fuel supplies in 1940 were critically short. Civilian fuel was rationed to essential services, yet canal boats, running on diesel engines that consumed 2 gallons per day, or moved by horsepower that consumed only hay, operated outside the fuel economy entirely. The Germans were tracking every gallon of fuel imported through British ports, calculating how long the nation could sustain its military operations. Their calculations assumed road and rail transport. They never factored in the 18th century canals that ran on renewable energy and pre-industrial infrastructure. This wasn't accidental, and it wasn't desperation. The Ministry of War Transport's Emergency Powers Act of August 1939 included specific provisions for canal requisitioning, drafted before the war began. British planners weren't clinging to obsolete technology out of nostalgia. They understood something fundamental about aerial reconnaissance. It depended on pattern recognition. Analysts identified military targets by looking for concentrations of activity, regular movements, and modern infrastructure. Canal traffic showed none of these signatures. Battlefields aren't testing grounds, and warfare isn't conducted under ideal conditions. German logistics doctrine assumed paved roads and clear weather. British canal boats operated regardless of conditions. When the winter of 1940–41 saw heavy snowfall that made many roads impassable and forced railway schedules to be cut by 40%, canal traffic continued. Ice up to 3 inches thick slowed boats but didn't stop them. Icebreaker boats, working in pairs, could maintain passage through frozen canals. A memorandum from the Grand Union Canal Company in January 1941 notes, lost 4 days to ice, road transport lost 18 days, railways operating at 60% capacity, canal traffic at 85% capacity despite conditions. What made this work wasn't any single feature, but rather the alignment of apparently obsolete characteristics with the specific requirements of defensive warfare under aerial attack. Speed didn't matter when you were moving supplies continuously, 24 hours a day, rather than in response to immediate tactical needs. The canals created a steady, predictable flow, slow but uninterruptible. Geographic constraints didn't matter, and the canals already connected every major industrial centre in the Midlands to ports and military depots. The routes were fixed, yes, but they were fixed along lines established specifically to connect centres of production with centres of consumption. The requirement for specialised crews became an advantage when those crews were civilians, women and older men not liable for military service. The idle women of the inland waterways, as they were officially known, from EW painted on their boats, were volunteers who freed up younger men for combat service whilst maintaining expert knowledge of every lock, bridge clearance and shallow stretch on their routes. A narrow boat crew knew their canal the way a taxi driver knows their city, not from maps, but from daily experience. This couldn't be replicated by drafted soldiers, but it didn't need to be. The crews were already there, operating a system they'd been born into. German intelligence operated on a principle of modern warfare. Critical infrastructure is modern infrastructure. They photographed factories, power stations, docks, railways and motorways. They counted aircraft, tanks and artillery pieces. They calculated industrial capacity and fuel reserves. Their analysis was thorough, professional and highly accurate, for everything they considered militarily relevant. Canals weren't militarily relevant. They'd been obsolete since railways were invented. This assessment was correct in every context except the one that mattered. A nation under aerial siege, short on fuel, needing to move supplies without being targeted. The British didn't trick the Germans. They simply used infrastructure the Germans had correctly assessed as obsolete for modern offensive warfare. But Britain wasn't conducting offensive warfare in 1940. It was surviving. And survival didn't require the fastest or most modern systems. It required systems that worked when everything else was being bombed. The canals worked because they were redundant, dispersed, difficult to target, and invisible to the analytical frameworks German intelligence used to understand British capabilities. Consider the targeting calculus. A railway marshalling yard is a concentrated target. Destroy the rail junction and you sever dozens of routes. A motorway intersection controls regional road traffic. Crater it, and you've blocked transport across an entire sector. But a canal? To meaningfully disrupt canal transport, you'd need to destroy locks, aqueducts, or tunnel entrances, structures scattered across 4,250 miles of waterway. The targeting mathematics made no sense. You'd expend dozens of sorties for minimal strategic effect. So the Germans didn't bomb the canals. They bombed the railways and roads, which made logical sense as targets, and never realised they were attacking the decoy whilst the real supply line floated peacefully past at 3 miles per hour beneath the tree cover. The narrow boat crews weren't soldiers, and that was precisely the point. Doris Smith, who crewed boats on the Grand Union Canal from June 1940 to March 1945, recalled in a 1987 interview, "The men at the locks thought we were just girls playing at canal work. Let them think it. We were carrying ammunition that could blow us all to kingdom come if we hit something wrong. But we looked like we were carrying coal. That was the whole idea. Look ordinary." The Ministry of War Transport deliberately recruited women with no canal experience for some routes, calculating that novice crews would appear even less suspicious than experienced boaters. Training took 6 weeks, learning to handle locks, read canal depth markers, and manage the heavy cargo loads. The training manual never mentioned what they'd actually be carrying. The boats themselves were camouflaged by being unchanged. No military markings, no unusual modifications, no deviation from standard commercial patterns. A narrow boat carrying 20 tons of artillery shells looked identical to a narrow boat carrying 20 tons of pottery clay because it was identical. Same boat, same crew, same route it had been running since 1935. The cargo was covered with standard tarpaulins. The manifests, if checked, showed generic descriptions, engineering supplies, or factory goods. This wasn't sophisticated deception. It was bureaucratic mundanity weaponized as camouflage. Ministry records show that canal boats delivered supplies to 76 separate military installations between 1940 and 1942. Installations the Germans knew existed but couldn't effectively target because they received supplies from infrastructure that didn't appear on military logistics maps. The 58th 2nd London Division, stationed in Hertfordshire, received 78% of its ammunition via the Lee Navigation and Regent's Canal. German reconnaissance photographed the base repeatedly, noting its lack of significant motor transport activity. Intelligence assessments concluded it was lightly supplied, possibly a training unit rather than frontline troops. The reality was that it was supplied via a waterway the Germans dismissed as civilian infrastructure. What the Germans failed to grasp was that modernization creates dependencies. Their own logistics system was magnificently efficient. When roads were passable, bridges were intact, and fuel was available. But it was a system that required modern infrastructure. British canal boats required water, which fell from the sky, and hay for horses or minimal diesel for engines. They required locks built in 1790 that still worked perfectly in 1940, because their engineering was simple and their maintenance was continuous. They didn't require anything the Luftwaffe could meaningfully interdict. A German logistics manual from 1940, captured in North Africa, specified optimal conditions for supply operations: hard surface roads, clear weather, 200 kilometers daily movement, centralized fuel distribution. Every specification was an assumption about infrastructure. British canal operations assumed none of these things. They assumed soft earth banks, variable weather, 8 kilometers daily movement, and decentralized operations where each boat was an independent unit. The German system was objectively superior in ideal conditions. The British system was objectively inferior in ideal conditions. But the skies over Britain in 1940 were anything but ideal. General Major Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, captured in North Africa in 1942, discussed British logistics in recorded conversations with fellow prisoners. He noted, "The British showed extraordinary capacity to continue operations despite our air superiority. Their supply lines appeared primitive but proved resilient. We could not understand how they sustained their forces." He was recorded speculating about hidden underground railways and camouflaged motor columns. He never mentioned canals. Even in captivity, with time to analyze British methods, German officers couldn't conceive that the answer was boats moving at walking speed through waterways built for the coal trade. By 1943, with the immediate threat of invasion past, the Ministry of War Transport began shifting more supplies back to railways and motor transport. Canal traffic declined to 60% of its 1940 peak. The boats had served their purpose. They'd kept supplies flowing during the critical period when Britain stood alone, when every gallon of fuel mattered, and when the Luftwaffe controlled the daylight skies. They'd done this not by being better than modern transport, but by being different in ways that aligned perfectly with the specific problems of that specific moment. The lesson wasn't that old technology was superior. The lesson was that obsolete is a context-dependent judgment. German intelligence officers looked at canal boats and saw obsolete commercial traffic, because in the context of modern mechanized warfare, that's what canal boats were. British logistics officers looked at the same boats and saw invisible supply lines, because in the context of aerial siege and fuel shortage, that's what canal boats became. Same infrastructure, different contexts, opposite conclusions. The narrow boats of 1940 were genuinely slower, less flexible, and more labour-intensive than motor lorries. Every criticism was accurate, but they were also invisible to aerial reconnaissance, independent of fuel supplies, operated by civilians not needed for combat service, and moved through infrastructure too dispersed to target effectively. These advantages didn't exist on paper. They existed in the messy reality of warfare conducted under conditions neither side had fully anticipated. When historians analyse the Battle of Britain and the Blitz, they focus on fighter aircraft, radar stations, and the courage of civilian populations under bombing. These are correct focuses, but in the background of every analysis sits an unexamined assumption that British forces remained supplied despite German air superiority. How they remained supplied, how 890,000 tons of military material moved through a transport network the enemy never targeted because they never recognized it as military infrastructure, is the story of the canal boats. The Germans had better aircraft, better bombing accuracy, and better intelligence capabilities than the British in 1940. What they lacked was historical imagination. They couldn't conceive that a major industrial nation fighting a modern war would rely on transport technology that predated railways. This failure of imagination wasn't stupidity. It was the natural consequence of thinking in modern, efficient, rational terms. Canal boats weren't modern, weren't efficient by contemporary measures, and weren't rational in the context of mobile warfare. But Britain wasn't fighting mobile warfare in 1940. It was fighting survival, and survival meant using every capability available, especially the capabilities the enemy didn't think worth destroying. The narrow boats moved slowly through the English countryside, past meadows and under stone bridges built when Napoleon ruled France. They looked like relics because they were relics, and because they were relics, they were invisible. Because they were invisible, they worked. This wasn't sophisticated deception or advanced technology. It was the weaponization of the mundane, the transformation of Britain's oldest transport infrastructure into its most secure supply line. The Germans never realized troops were moving because they couldn't imagine that troops would move that way. By the time they might have realized their error, the crisis had passed, and the canal boats were returning to carrying coal and pottery clay. They'd saved Britain not by being impressive, but by being overlooked. Sometimes, in warfare as in life, the most powerful advantage is simply being underestimated.